They dragged Wren up the scaffold steps with a noose waiting, her wrists bound in rope, and not one soul guessed the tired stranger nearby would save her life before that rope ever closed, or that he was the deadliest gunslinger 3 territories had ever produced. Her feet were bare on the rough planking. The noose above her head swung a little in the wind like it was impatient. She was 26 years old. Her name was Wren Halloway. She had not murdered anybody, and in about 2 minutes the county was going to hang her for it anyway, unless something changed, and nothing in that crowd looked like it was fixing to change. If you're new to this fire tonight, partner, go on and hit subscribe, ring that little bell so you don't miss the next one, and tell me true, where are you listening from tonight, and what time is it where you're sitting? I read every answer. Now, let's back up. Let's go back to how a good woman with clean hands ends up standing on a gallows in a town that should have known better. Wren came to Larkspur Flats in the spring of 1879, 19 years old, married 3 weeks to a quiet, careful man named Silas Halloway, who had spent his whole youth saving wages as a wheelwright in Missouri so that one day he could buy land nobody else wanted. They'd met at a church social in Independence, where Silas had said maybe 11 words to her the entire evening, and every one of them had been useful, which was, Wren later admitted, the exact quality that had won her over. He found that land on the Cimarron bench above Larkspur Flats, 80 acres of red rock and stubborn grass that the previous owner had given up on, and within 4 years Silas had coaxed an actual working spread out of it, a stone well, a smokehouse, 60 head of cattle, and a pasture that greened up earlier in spring than anybody else's because of the way the bench caught runoff from the mesa above it. Wren kept the books. She could read a ledger the way some men could read a poker table, and she'd caught 2 separate freighting outfits shorting Silas on delivered feed before he'd even noticed the wagons were light. She just had it, the way some people have a good ear for music, and she used it quietly. The way people do who've learned that a smart woman in a small town gets watched more than she gets thanked. The trouble arrived with a name attached, and the name was Royce Denholm. Denholm ran the Larkspur Mercantile, the feed lot, the only working stamp mill within 40 miles, and held paper on half the ranchers in the county, through a bank he'd founded mostly to hold paper on half the ranchers in the county. He was 53, thick through the shoulders, going soft, with the kind of laugh that made strangers like him for about 10 minutes before they noticed it never reached his eyes. Denholm had wanted the Halloway bench since before Silas bought it, because a surveyor's error nobody but Denholm knew about put a vein of silver-bearing quartz, almost certainly running under that stubborn red rock. He offered to buy the place twice. Silas turned him down twice, politely, the way he did everything, and made the mistake of telling Wren that Denholm's third offer had a threat folded up inside the friendly language of it, which Wren believed instantly because she had watched Denholm's eyes while he made the first 2. Denholm did not work alone, and it's worth naming the men who stood at his shoulder, because a rot like his never spreads without help. There was Purdy Vance, who loaded feed wagons 3 days a week and drank the other 4, a man with no particular gift except a willingness to say whatever he was paid to say and say it loud. There was Sheriff Otis Grange, heavy and unhurried, who had worn a badge in Larkspur Flats for 11 years, and had long since stopped pretending, even to himself, that the badge answered to anybody but the bank that funded his salary. And there was Cassius Doyle, who did the quiet work neither Vance's mouth nor Grange's badge could manage, a tall, narrow man who'd drifted into the county 2 years back with no history anybody could verify, and had made himself useful to Denholm in ways nobody asked too many questions about. Vance's vice was cowardice, dressed up as loyalty. Grange's vice was a fear of poverty, so deep it had eaten every other instinct he'd once had. Doyle's vice didn't have a name so much as a temperature, cold enough that even Denholm, by most accounts, was careful around him. What came after the third refusal was a slow bleeding rather than a single wound. The bank called Silas's note early, citing a clause Silas swore he'd never signed, though the signature at the bottom looked enough like his that a judge wouldn't blink at it. The county assessor reappraised the bench at triple its value, which tripled the taxes, and the assessor was a cousin of Denholm's wife. 2 hired hands quit within a week of each other, both suddenly flush with cash they wouldn't explain. Silas rode to Sheriff Grange's office twice that summer to report the harassment plainly, the phantom signature, the reassessment, the sudden quitting. And both times he came away with the distinct sense that Grange had heard every word, because Grange's continued comfort depended a good deal more on Denholm's goodwill than on Silas Halloway's. And on a July night with no moon, someone shot Silas Halloway through the chest as he walked the fence line checking on a heifer that had gone missing, and left him to bleed out alone in the dark with his rifle still in its scabbard on his saddle 100 yards off, because whoever did it wanted it to look like Silas never got the chance to defend himself, which was, in its own vicious way, accurate. Wren found him at first light, face down in the shallows where the fence line met the creek bank, the water around him gone the color of rust in the early sun. She held his hand until it went cold, and she did not scream, because screaming was a thing she could not afford to start, and then be unable to stop. And there was already, even in that first hour, a cold, clear part of her mind cataloging everything around her, the angle he was lying at, the dry ground upstream that showed no sign he'd fallen there himself. Fact that whoever had done this had known exactly which hour of night to choose. She rode into town herself to fetch the sheriff, a heavy, unhurried man named Otis Grange, who took his salary, his Sunday dinners, and his loyalty from the same source, which was Royce Denholm's bank account. By the time Wren reached the jailhouse, a man named Purdy Vance was already there, ahead of her, telling anyone who'd listened that he'd heard Silas and Wren fighting bitterly the night before, loud enough to carry across 2 fence lines, which was a lie, because Vance worked 3 days a week loading feed wagons for Denholm, and had not been within 2 miles of the Halloway bench that night, and Wren knew it, and Grange, watching his own boots the whole time he said it, almost certainly knew it too. They arrested her by supper time. She spent 5 days in a cell at the end of Grange's hallway with a plank wall between her and the front office thin enough to carry every careless word said on the other side of it, and Wren, who had spent 4 years catching freight outfits, shorting her husband by the pound, spent those 5 days doing the same work on her own case, cataloging every voice, every name, every scrap of what leaked through that wall, because information was the only thing in that cell nobody could take away from her. She learned the circuit judge riding in for her trial, a man named Corliss, had stayed 2 nights at Denholm's own house on his way through, which a judge riding a fair circuit generally does not do. She learned Denholm's lawyer, a slick, unhurried man out of Santa Fe named Aldous Creed, had arrived a full day before her arrest was even official, which meant somebody had known what was coming before it came. She slept badly those 5 nights, when she slept at all, on a cot too short for her and a blanket that smelled of every man who'd occupied that cell before her, and she spent the dark hours the way she'd once spent long winter evenings balancing Silas's books, running the same figures over and over until they came out the same way twice. Because a fact checked twice was a fact she could stand on later, and she had a feeling standing on facts was about to become the only thing keeping her upright at all. The trial ran 3 hours on a Thursday. 12 men sat the jury box, 8 of them owing money to Denholm's Bank or wages to Denholm's Mill, which in a town the size of Larkspur Flats accounted for most of the men fit to serve. Vance took the stand and told his invented story, with his eyes drifting up and to the left every time he had to invent a new detail, which is what a man's eyes do when he's building a memory instead of retrieving one. Judge Corliss moved the proceedings along at a brisk clip that struck Ezra Todd, watching from the defense table, as considerably faster than any trial he'd sat through before. Objections waved off almost before he'd finished raising them, and twice he asked for a recess, to consult his own notes, and twice Corliss denied it on grounds that the court's time was valuable, which it apparently was given, how little of it the court intended to spend. Creed handled the prosecution with the smooth, unbothered competence of a man who has done this exact kind of work before and expects to do it again, laying his case out like a man, setting a table he already knew the guests for. The court-appointed defense, a decent, overmatched young man named Ezra Todd, did what he could with almost nothing to work with. No funds for an investigator, no time granted to chase down the 2 witnesses who might have placed Doyle's horse near the creek that night, which the court had no particular interest in hearing about. The jury deliberated for 22 minutes. Wren stood in the dock and looked at Royce Denholm, sitting in the second row with his hat in his lap and his face arranged into something like sorrow. And she held that look on him until he was the one who had to glance away first, which was the only victory the day handed her. They set the hanging for Saturday morning. They took her bootlaces the first night and her belt the second. When they walked her out into the cold that Saturday, hands bound in front of her, the whole length of Larkspur Flats, one real street stretched out ahead, ending at the gallows the town had built special for the occasion at the east edge of town. She climbed the steps without anybody's help. She stood on the boards and looked out over maybe 70 people, most of them men, most of them finding the ground in front of their own boots more interesting than the platform, though a few watched openly the way people watch a wagon wreck they can't look away from. Denholm stood near the front with Creed at his elbow and 2 of his hired men flanking him. He was not looking at the ground. Wren looked at him until again he broke first. That was when she heard the hoofbeats, slow, unhurried, coming in off the west road at a pace that had nothing anxious in it at all, which was strange enough on its own that half the crowd turned to look for the reason. A rider on a rust-colored gelding, hat brim low against the morning sun, a canvas duster gone the color of old rope from years of weather. Moving like a man with all the time God had ever made, he drew up at the edge of the crowd. His eyes went from the platform to the rope looped over the crossbeam, to Wren standing steady on the boards, to the young deputy at the lever, a boy named Cole Pruitt who looked like he'd rather be anywhere on earth than where his boots currently stood. The stranger looked at that boy for a long moment. Then he said 2 words quiet enough that the whole street had to lean in to catch them, and final enough that nobody mistook them for a request. Denholm stepped forward out of the crowd's edge, and to his credit, whatever else the man was, he was no coward, and his voice carried steady and loud when he informed the stranger that this was a lawful execution of a lawful sentence. The man on the gelding turned his head toward him slow, the way a man looks at a sum he's already worked out twice and doesn't need worked out a third time. That verdict came out of a bought courtroom. Your witness invented his story, standing in this street. Your judge slept under your own roof 2 nights ago. He looked at Denholm the way you'd look at a debt come due. You've got about 30 seconds to tell your man to cut her down before this turns into something your lawyer can't write his way out of. Who in God's name are you? Denholm said, and it wasn't really a question, more a demand aimed at buying himself time to think, and it went unanswered because the stranger had already stopped looking at him and started counting. 30 seconds passed, in that cold morning air, like the longest half-minute the town of Larkspur Flats had ever sat through. Cole Pruitt looked at the rope. He looked at the stranger. He looked at Royce Denholm, who was not, at that particular moment, looking back at him with any answer worth following. And then the boy made the single most important decision of his short career, and put the blade to the rope above Wren's head, and the crowd let out a breath like one animal, and Wren's knees went for just a second. The stranger had already swung down off his horse. He came through the crowd, which parted for him in that particular uneasy way crowds part for something they don't understand, but have correctly guessed they'd better not stand in front of. He reached the base of the scaffold steps and looked up at her. "Come on down. Your horse is here." She looked toward the edge of the crowd where a gray mare named Juniper stood, held loose by one of Denholm's own men, taken off the Halloway bench along with everything else that had been hers a week ago. The man, holding the reins, let them drop the instant the stranger's eyes landed on him. Behind Denholm, one of his hired men let his hand drift toward his hip, and the stranger turned just far enough for the man to get a good, clean look at his face, and whatever that face was telling him, it was enough to stop the hand cold before it finished its trip. Denholm's voice had dropped low enough now that it barely carried past the front row. "This is interference with a lawful sentence. It's interference with a murder." The stranger looked back up at Wren. "Ride north. I'll be behind you." Wren Halloway had spent 5 days in a jail cell, deciding exactly what she'd do the moment an opening came, if one ever came, and she was not a woman who waited on somebody else to finish deciding her circumstances for. She came down the steps, steady, took Juniper's reins, looked once more at Royce Denholm the way she'd looked at him across the courtroom 3 days before, and put her heels to the mare and rode north at a hard canter. The stranger mounted his gelding and came on behind her, at the same unhurried pace he'd ridden in with, like there was nothing behind him worth hurrying from, and 70 people stood in the cold and watched them go, and not one of them moved to stop it. They rode the better part of an hour without a word passing between them, and Wren's silence wasn't shock, because she'd used up her allotment of shock somewhere around day 2 in that cell. She was doing arithmetic. Who could be trusted? What she had left in the world, what Denholm's next move would be. What the man, riding 40 yards behind her, intended once they finally stopped moving. Because she had learned this past week that unexamined assumptions were the most expensive thing a person could carry. When the town had dropped below the horizon behind them, she turned in the saddle and let him catch up even with her. You could have been shot back there. He watched the road ahead. Could have. That didn't trouble you, not particularly. She studied him properly for the first time. Somewhere past 40, she guessed, weather written into his face alongside something else she couldn't yet name. His hand sat easy and still on the reins. The rifle riding in his saddle scabbard was old but plainly well kept. The revolver on his hip sat the way a thing sits when it's been there so long it stopped being separate from the man wearing it. There was nothing showy about any of it, no silver conchos, no fast-draw rig, nothing that announced itself, and Wren, who had spent 4 years learning to read a wagon's load by the sound of its wheels on gravel, "What do they call you?" He was quiet long enough that she started to think this question would join Denholm's in going unanswered. "Folks call me Gideon. Is that your given name?" "It's the one that gets used." She let that stand. A hawk turned slow circles over something dead in the grass off to the east. "Where are we headed? You got anybody out past Denholm's reach for tonight?" She'd already run the list in her head 3 times over. The Merricks were 6 miles east, decent people, but she wasn't about to point Denholm's attention at their door, not when they had children asleep under that roof and a mortgage held by the same bank that held everybody else's. Her sister in Trinidad was 4 hard days in the wrong direction and didn't know any of this had happened yet, and there was no way to get word to her that wouldn't take longer than whatever time they actually had. There's a line shack on the north corner of our land. Denholm's men won't ride up on it in daylight. It's too visible from the road. Come dark, they might chance it. Show me. The shack was single room, double log, built solid by whoever had worked that corner of the bench before Silas bought it. Silas had kept it stocked against a hard winter cutting them off from town, a possibility that visited this stretch of the territory with some regularity, and the woodpile was decent, the water barrel 3/4 full, and a lever-action rifle hung on a peg by the door that Wren had put rounds through every season since she was 19. She built up the fire while Gideon walked the perimeter in the last daylight, reading the approach off the south trail, the tree line behind, the dry wash to the east that could hide a man crawling in quiet. When he came back inside, she poured coffee into a tin cup and set it across the fire in front of him without being asked, because it was cold and there was coffee and it seemed the plain and obvious thing to do. "You knew Denholm was behind it before you rode into town. I knew you hadn't killed your husband. How?" "Shot at that range from behind. There'd have been powder residue on your hands. The report never mentioned it." He looked into the fire. Either Grange left that out because somebody told him to, or it didn't fit the story he'd already been handed. "You read the sheriff's report before you rode in." "Before I rode in," he agreed. She sat with that a moment. "You were already coming, before you ever got there. This wasn't chance." "I heard there was a widow set to hang in Larkspur Flats for a killing she didn't do, and I knew whose ground she was standing on when it happened." He looked at the fire a long moment. "Royce Denholm and I have history. 3 years back, out of a mining camp called Esperanza, down in the Sonora country, he arranged the killing of a freight man there named Abel Voss. Voss pulled me out of a flooded shaft when I was 19 years old and half drowned and owed him a debt I never got the chance to pay back before Denholm's men put him in the ground over a claim dispute." He was quiet a moment before he went on. "Denholm ran a smaller operation back then, a stamp mill and half a claim map, but the shape of it was the same shape you're looking at now. Buy a man out, and if buying doesn't take, bury the paper trail deep enough that a widow or an orphan can't dig their way back out of it. Voss left a wife and a boy about 7 years old. I rode out the day after the burying to bring them what little I had to give. and she looked at me the way a person looks at somebody who's arrived a day too late to matter. And she wasn't wrong to look at me that way. I've spent 3 years since trying to arrive on time for somebody. You're the first one I've managed it for. Wren turned that over. You've been carrying something against him since then. Depositions. A paper trail on the money that moved from Denholm to the men who did it. Sitting in safekeeping in Santa Fe, waiting on the right legal moment to matter. He looked at her. Your situation gives mine somewhere to stand? It opens doors his arrangement with this county can't shut. She sat with that. The fire popped and settled between them, and the shack held solid against a rising wind outside. The deed to our land is missing. Silas always carried the original on him. It wasn't there when I found him. If Denholm's filed a false transfer at the land office already, you can't fight it without the original or a certified copy. Creed had papers drawn up before I was even arrested. She looked at her hands. Silas had a man at Denholm's mill who used to warn him when trouble was coming before it landed. Denholm keeps every land file he's ever built in a back room off the mill office. Every deed, every note, every piece of paper on every property he's taken or working to take. How many men usually sleep at that mill overnight? 2. Most nights, maybe 3 if he's worried. He'll be worried tonight. Gideon stood and lifted his hat off the peg and settled it on. Bolt the door behind me. 2 knocks, a pause, 1 more knock after that's how you'll know it's me. She looked at him standing there, composed for whatever was coming, already 3 moves ahead in his own head. I want to know what kind of man you are before tonight's done. He stood quiet a moment, not defensive about it, just considering. The kind that Royce Denholm ought to have left well alone. He went out. She bolted the door and sat with Silas's rifle across her knees and did not sleep. An owl worked the tree line once. A coyote gave 2 short notes far to the north and went quiet. Around 2 in the morning she heard 3 horses moving fast toward town. Then a long silence after. At 3:45 came 2 knocks, a pause, 1 more. She opened the door. He came in with a tin document box under one arm and a cloth wrapped tight around his left hand, set the box on the table, and dropped into the chair across from it. 3 men at the mill tonight, not 2. One went for his gun. He'll keep his hand for a while yet, but he won't be quick with it. She found the deed inside the box, original, notarized in Larkspur Flats in the spring of 1875, Silas's careful hand, both their names on it. She held it a long moment without a word because there wasn't an adequate one for holding the thing her husband had died protecting. She cleaned the cut across his knuckles while he sat still for it. And then the careful inventory she'd been keeping for 5 days came out of her in a rush. They had the deed now, but Denholm still had Vance and Grange and a county judge in his pocket, and the land office would stall, regardless of what paper she held, and Grange would simply claim she'd escaped lawful custody the moment anyone asked. There's a federal marshal's office out of Santa Fe. Land fraud crosses county lines, the second money moves across them, which Denholm's has, repeatedly. You write out everything tonight, the rigged trial, Vance's perjury, the deed, your husband's murder, every name you've got, Denholm, Vance, Creed, Grange, Judge Corliss, staying under. I've got a rider, I trust, with a fast horse. It can leave before morning. You already arranged a rider before I ever fell asleep the first night I heard your name. She looked at him a long moment across the table. This man who'd ridden into a public hanging on a rumor, and then walked 3 armed men down at a silver mill before dawn to retrieve a box of paper, and she asked him to tell her everything he knew about the man named Cassius Doyle who did Denholm's uglier work because 2 people had told her quietly, off the record, that they'd seen Doyle's horse near the fence line the night Silas died, and neither one would say it to a badge. Gideon listened to all of it without once interrupting, and, when she'd finished, he told her to write her letter and sleep a few hours after, that he'd keep watch. The letter took her 2 hours, written the way she did everything that mattered, precise, dated, naming every name. Gideon read it after, corrected one date, folded it into his coat, and 15 minutes later, she heard him trade a few low words with someone at the door, and then hoofbeats moving south fast into the dark. She lay down with the rifle beside her and slept without dreaming. She woke to gray light, wood smoke, and coffee. Gideon was outside working the tree line at first light, and when she came to the door, he was crouched at the clearing's edge reading tracks in the frost. Somebody rode up close in the night, then turned back. Scouting. They'll come in force before noon. They spent the morning on practical things. He walked every approach to the shack with her, cut 2 firing positions into the brush where the tree line gave a clean angle on the trail, checked every window's sight line, judged the wood and water adequate. Over jerky and hardtack mid-morning, Wren set her cup down. Doyle will ride with them. I'm not asking you to do murder on my account. I want that said plainly. But if that man comes onto this land meaning to finish what he started against my husband, I mean to be the one who answers for it. Gideon held her look a long moment. All right. They spent what remained of that morning on the kind of preparation that doesn't look like much from a distance, but decides everything up close. Gideon walked her through loading and reloading Silas's lever action until her hands did it without her eyes needing to check the work, because a fight after dark or in a hurry punishes anybody whose fingers have to think. He had her pace off the distance from the east window to the tree line twice out loud, so the number would sit in her body and not just her head, and he showed her where a man's silhouette would break the skyline coming up from the wash and where it wouldn't. He strung a thin trip line of braided rawhide low across the south trail, tied to a cluster of tin cups and cattle bells scavenged from the shack's shed, the kind of thing that wouldn't stop a rider, but would announce him a good 30 seconds before he expected to be announced, which in Gideon's accounting was worth more than most weapons. He banked the fire low and had her practice moving through the one-room shack in the dark without a lamp until she could cross it without a sound. None of it was complicated. All of it was the difference, he told her, between a woman defending a cabin and a woman who already knew exactly what was going to happen in every corner of it before it happened. Wren watched him check the angle of the second firing position one more time. You've done this before, set a place up to be defended. More times than I'd have chosen if choosing had come into it. He didn't offer more, and she didn't press, because she'd learned already that the man gave up what he meant to give up, and nothing came out of him early. Nobody's forgetting where we are, partner, but let's keep moving, because the riders were already coming, and it's about time we told you what came of it. 6 riders came up the south trail at a canter a little after 11, and the trip line did its work exactly as promised, the far-off jangle of tin and cattle bell carrying across the flat a good half-minute before the riders themselves came into view, which gave Gideon time to settle onto the porch with the unhurried look of a man who'd been standing there all morning, and gave Wren time to slip into position at the east window, with her heartbeat the only thing in the room moving fast. Doyle rode point, tall, narrow-faced, a stillness to him that Wren had learned to think of as a predator conserving itself rather than resting. Beside him rode a broad, loud-mouthed man named Wren Halloway, useful for noise and not much beyond it, and 4 hired guns Wren didn't recognize, likely bought cheap and recent, the kind of men who drifted through a county for a season and moved on once the money did. Gideon stood the porch. Wren held the east window from behind the frame, out of sight from the trail, rifle steady. Doyle pulled up his horse and looked Gideon over. "This is Denholm land. You're trespassing. The deed sits with its rightful owner. Your land office filing rests on perjured testimony, and everybody riding with you already knows it." Doyle's eyes swept the shack, hunting for Wren, and didn't find her. "You cut her down in town yesterday." Something moved behind his face that wasn't quite recognition yet, but closing on it. Wren's rifle cracked clean in the cold air. The shot took his hat clean off an inch above his scalp, deliberate as her own signature, and his hand froze halfway to his hip. The 4 hired men went stone still in their saddles. Wren stepped out onto the porch beside Gideon, rifle level, a fresh round already chambered. Her voice was level as a plumb line. "You shot my husband in the back at that fence line. You took his watch and whatever he was carrying, and you had Purdy Vance standing in front of Sheriff Grange before sunup swearing you were somewhere you weren't. 2 people saw your horse that night. They were too frightened to say so to a badge. I am not frightened." Doyle said nothing. His jaw worked once. He looked toward Gideon, standing loose and easy at Wren's shoulder, hands open at his sides, his face giving away exactly nothing, the particular stillness of a man with no urgent stake in whichever way Doyle chose next, which was, if a person thought about it. Wren Halloway shifted in his saddle like he meant to say something to fill the silence the way loud men do when a quiet stretches past what they can tolerate, and thought better of it the instant Gideon's eyes flicked his way and settled back down without a word. Which told Wren plainly enough which of these 6 men actually decided anything, and which one simply followed whoever was deciding. "Raise your hands." Doyle raised them. Behind him, Otway and the 4 hired men sat their horses, without moving, without reaching. 5 separate calculations arriving at the identical answer, which was that this was not a morning that rewarded anybody's aggression. Ride for Santa Fe, not to surrender to understand what's already moving. Inside 3 days, this land falls under federal jurisdiction on a murder and fraud investigation, and every name that rides with Denholm is already written down in a federal marshal's office. She looked down the line of riders, one face at a time. "Come back onto this ground without my leave again, and it won't be a warning shot next time." Doyle lowered his hand slowly and bent to retrieve his hat from the dirt, turning it over once in his hands, looking at Wren with an expression she couldn't fully read, not defeat exactly, but something adjacent to it. "Your husband wasn't a fighting man. He meant it as an insult, and it landed somewhere else instead. He wasn't. He was the best hand with land I ever knew, and he built something worth having out of rock everybody else had given up on. And you killed him for ground that was never yours to want." She held the rifle steady. "Go," they went. Wren watched until the sound of them died below the southern rise, then set the rifle down against the wall, and sat on the step and put her face in her hands, not from breaking, because she wasn't and didn't intend to, but from the particular exhaustion that arrives once a thing you've been holding together by will alone is finally, briefly, Allowed to loosen, Gideon sat on the step below her, and let the quiet do its work without adding to it, which struck her, in the part of her mind that never stopped watching, as exactly the right instinct. You think they actually ride for Santa Fe? Doyle rides back to Denholm, first reports. Denholm spends the next several days weighing how real the federal angle is and how much risk he's willing to sit on, and every one of those days, my letter's getting closer to a marshal's desk. Men like Denholm don't operate well on incomplete information. You've done this a long while. He didn't answer that directly. After a moment, he looked south at the empty trail, dust settling in the cold noon light. Tell me about the last item in that tin box, besides the deed. She hadn't mentioned a second item. She looked at him, unsurprised in the small way that had started to feel familiar, and went inside and came back with a folded letter in Silas's hand, dated 3 weeks before his death, addressed to the federal marshal's office in Santa Fe. Silas had been quietly building his own complaint, documenting the false tax reassessment, the forged note, the 2 hired hands who'd quit within days of each other, his suspicion that Denholm meant to manufacture a legal excuse to take the bench outright. He'd never sent it. Gideon read it slowly, and when he looked up, his face had gone somewhere. Wren hadn't yet seen it go. He knew. He knew what was coming, and that nobody local would lift a hand to stop it. He was building a record in case it went the way it went. Wren's voice was quiet. He was a careful man, yes. They sat with that a while in the cold afternoon. That letter travels to Santa Fe with mine, then. Corroboration from the man Denholm killed in his own hand. It'll matter. He looked at her. Denholm comes himself once the uncertainty wears on him enough. He'll bring Creed and Grange and make his case about lawful custody. And when he does, the Esperanza record stands right behind it, Abel Voss's death, already in a federal file, with a corroborating witness deposed last month. He's exposed in 2 territories at once, not 1. You've been patient a long time. 3 years, carrying a case across half the territory, waiting on the right moment to ride into a public hanging and cut a stranger down off a scaffold, because the timing had finally lined up. He was quiet. Not entirely a question. He looked south, toward the horizon where the red rock met the flat winter sky, and something crossed his face that was neither pride nor regret. The kind who was there the first time and stayed too far on the edge of it to stop what happened. She understood, without needing to ask further, that he meant Esperanza, that he'd been close enough to Abel Voss's death to carry it and not close enough to prevent it, and that he'd been hauling that weight the whole 3 years since. Denholm arrived the next morning in his own carriage, Creed beside him, Grange trailing on horseback with 2 men who weren't quite deputies. The carriage stopped at the clearing's edge, and Denholm stepped down with his hands folded behind his back, walking toward the shack with the unhurried air of a man arriving to make a reasonable offer. Gideon met him halfway across the clearing, and the 2 men stood measuring each other in a silence that told Wren, watching from the doorway, that this was not the first time they'd stood at close range with something unsettled between them. Denholm's voice was low, meant only for the 2 of them. I know exactly who you are. Then you know what I'm carrying. Evidence that won't hold in a New Mexico courtroom. You're a wanted man 3 territories over. That evidence belongs to Abel Voss's widow. She's no fugitive. She filed federal in Sonora 6 months back. waiting on a corroborating witness for the money trail. That witness gave his deposition last month. It's sitting in the federal record right now. A pause, deliberate. Your Larkspur operation and your Esperanza operation are about to get investigated on the same calendar. Creed spoke up from behind Denholm's shoulder, careful and professional. When precisely was this deposition filed? Last month, federal record. Check it through whatever channel you trust. Gideon looked at him. You know how to use proper channels. Use them. The look that passed between Denholm and Creed then was the look of two men who'd planned a long campaign and just discovered ground underfoot they hadn't surveyed. Wren stepped off the porch and crossed to stand close enough to see Denholm's face whole. She held up the deed where he couldn't fail to see it. 80 acres notarized in 1875. That land was never legally transferred, and the filing your lawyers already lodged rests on testimony you bought with fear. You had my husband killed for a stone he was standing on. Denholm looked at her, and for the first time she could recall, something moved across his face that wasn't calculation and wasn't contempt. The scan. It was the look of a man feeling a structure he'd spent years building begin to shift under its own foundation. You can't prove a word of that. Cassius Doyle can, the moment a federal marshal offers him a better arrangement than you ever did. She let that land, and my husband left a letter. 3 weeks before you had him killed, he wrote out everything you were doing to us. He just never had the chance to send it. Denholm went very still. Wren turned to Creed. Leave this land today and don't come back. If any harm reaches me, or this ground before the marshal arrives, the deposition already on federal record gets supplemented with a sworn account of this exact conversation. You heard every word of it. Sheriff Grange, sitting his horse a little back from the rest, cleared his throat like he meant to add something official-sounding about custody or jurisdiction, some last scrap of authority he still imagined he carried, and then thought better of it when Wren's eyes swung to him and stayed there long enough to say everything she wasn't bothering to say out loud. He had signed the paper that arrested her. He had let a lie stand in his own office rather than lose his position over it. He looked away first, same as Denholm had on the scaffold, and said nothing at all. Creed, a competent man who understood precisely when a situation had turned past negotiating, touched Denholm's sleeve. The wind moved through the dry grass around them all in the same direction. Denholm turned, without another word, and walked back to his carriage, and Creed and Grange and the two half-deputies went with him, and the carriage swung south and did not come back. The marshal rode in on Thursday, a lean, closely bearded man named Corbin Hale, with the settled manner of somebody who'd long since stopped needing to prove his competence to anybody. He read both letters at the shack's rough table, drank 2 cups of coffee, and put questions to Wren for the better part of 2 hours, then spoke with Gideon, alone in the yard, for nearly as long. He asked Wren to walk him through the ledger discrepancies she had caught years back, the shorted freight, the pattern of it, because a man who's chased paper trails for a living knows that a woman who can spot a light wagon by the pound is a woman whose testimony will hold up in front of a federal judge. And he told her plainly that her own precision was going to matter more in the courtroom to come than any single piece of evidence Gideon had carried in from Sonora. By Friday evening, there was a federal warrant out on Royce Denholm for land fraud and conspiracy to commit murder. Cassius Doyle was taken at the mill Saturday morning, still showing up for his shift, which told Hale plenty about how badly the man had misjudged how fast this was moving. Doyle struck a deal with the marshal's office that same afternoon, a full account of the night Silas Halloway died, which put a fourth charge on Denholm before the week was out. Aldous Creed gave a voluntary statement, being, as Wren had already judged him, a man who read a room accurately and knew which way the wind had turned. Fenn, Otway, and the 4 hired guns rode out of the county before the warrant was even served and never came back. Sheriff Otis Grange resigned his badge Saturday afternoon, a few hours after Denholm's arrest, and was never charged with anything, which was an outcome Wren had to sit with for a good while before she could set it down. Denholm himself was transported to Santa Fe under federal escort inside the month, and the trial that eventually followed there was nothing like the one that had nearly hanged her. No borrowed judge, no bought jury, just a plain record laid out in daylight. And it took the federal court considerably less time to reach the true verdict than it had taken Judge Corliss to reach the false one. She spent that Sunday walking her land. It was still good ground. It had always been good ground. That was the whole of what this had ever been about. And she walked the fence line where she'd found Silas and stood there a while, and then climbed the slope above the shack where the grass grew thick and green even in the cold season. She found the stone Silas had dug by hand the second summer, and the smokehouse he built with lumber hauled up from the mill before the mill belonged to men who wanted to use it against her, and she understood, walking it all in the low winter light, that none of it had ever been about hatred, not for Denholm, not really. It had only ever been about a vein of quartz under stubborn red rock that one greedy man had decided was worth more than the 2 lives standing on top of it. She thought about what Silas would have done with a Monday morning ahead of him, and the land finally secure, that he'd have mended the corner post on the north fence, gotten the winter feed stacked before the first real snow, sat at the kitchen table at night with coffee, and made a list of what came next. She went inside and started her own list. Gideon had his gelding saddled when she came back out. She'd more or less known this was coming since the first morning. She stood on the step and looked at him, and he looked back, and there was an understanding between them by then that this had always been the shape of the thing. There's work waiting on me. A widow in Sonora's been carrying a federal case 3 years for enough traction to move on it. It's got that now. Go, Wren said, and meant it plainly, without performance. She came down off the step and put her hand out. He looked at it a moment, this woman standing straight in a worn dress, with rope marks still faint on her wrists. Standing on land she'd fought to keep, and meant to keep, and he took her hand and shook it once. The north fence needs mending, I noticed. I'll have it done before the first snow. He nodded toward the shack, the slope, the pale winter sky lying flat over the mesa to the west. You'll manage. I only needed somebody to cut the rope first. He swung up onto the gelding. She stood in the yard and watched him ride south along the same trail he'd come in on until he was a shape against the horizon, and then a thin thread of dust, and then nothing at all, and the wind moved through the grass, and the creek ran on quiet behind the shack, and the sky held that hard, clean blue a good winter afternoon gets. And the land stretched out around her in every direction, hers now free and clear, the land she and Silas had built out of stubborn red rock, and nearly lost to a man who thought paper and fear could take the place of a deed. She went back inside. There was a list to make. I've been an old man a good long while now, partner, and I've sat in enough doorways in the low afternoon light thinking on what the years teach a person and what they don't. Here's what I've settled on. Courage was never the absence of fear, whatever the songs tell you. It's a woman standing on a scaffold with a rope brushing her neck, holding herself upright, refusing to beg, and later leveling a rifle at 6 armed men with her voice flat and even and true. Fear doesn't leave a person like that. It just quits running the show. And here's another thing I've settled on. Men like Royce Denholm, the ones who dress cruelty up in paperwork and rent the law out for their own purposes and call the whole ugly business commerce, they survive because the people around them keep choosing quiet. They count on a crowd that won't move. They count on every Cole Pruitt of the world keeping his hand on that lever, because that's what's always been asked of him, and nobody's ever stood in a cold street and said 2 plain words in a voice that left no room to argue otherwise. It doesn't take an army to break a thing like that. It takes one man willing to ride in off a slow road, and one woman who already decided, long before he arrived, that she wasn't going to be the kind of casualty a man like Denholm could file away and forget. I think, too, about Silas Halloway, who never gets to be the hero of a story like this one, on account of being gone before the second scene, but who built something worth a killing out of red rock everybody else had walked away from, and who spent his last weeks alive writing down the truth in a careful hand, because some part of him understood that the truth outlives the man who tells it, even when he isn't there to see it land. That's its own kind of courage, the quiet, unglamorous kind, the kind that doesn't get a rider coming in at dawn to cut it down off any gallows. It just does the work and hopes somebody, someday, reads the ledger right. Sometimes it only takes one person standing in the right place at the right hour. And sometimes the woman on the platform was never going to fall, regardless, not because a stranger happened along to cut her down, but because she'd already decided, days before, in a cell with a plank wall, that if she went down it would not be for weakness. That's Wren Halloway. That's the story of the man they called Gideon, who never gave a town anything more to hold on to than a name that wasn't quite his, who carried a patient reckoning across 3 territories in a tin box, waiting on the one thread worth pulling. He's out there somewhere, still some South Road, somewhere between wherever he was and wherever the next widow needs a rope cut. He doesn't look back. He never has. The real story was always hers. Keep your powder dry, friends. This story contains fictional elements created with the help of artificial intelligence. The characters, specific events, and dialogue are products of imagination, though the courage of ordinary people meeting extraordinary trouble belongs to the real history of the American frontier. If this one found you tonight, drop a 1 in the comments and tell me where you're watching from. Like this video, subscribe if you haven't, and I'll be right here with the next tale